All right, let's talk about some of history's most bizarre attempts at military innovation. I mean, we're talking about weapons so strange, so out there, they genuinely sound like they were pulled from a cartoon. But here's the thing. Every single one was a real project backed by real government money.
Okay, let's just dive right into our first exhibit, which asks a question that sounds completely ridiculous. Could bats actually win a war? As silly as it sounds, this was a very real, very serious American military project during World War II.
And that brings us to our first category, where we explore the strange and, let's be honest, often cruel history of weaponizing unsuspecting animals. Now, humans have used animals in war for centuries, but these next two examples, they take it to a whole new level of weird.
So, meet the bat bomb. The idea was dreamed up by, and you're not going to believe this, a dental surgeon. The plan was to release thousands of these bats, each with a tiny bomb strapped to it, over Japanese cities. The thinking was that Japan's buildings, made mostly of wood and paper, were super flammable. But how on earth were they supposed to make this work?
Well, the strategy, when you lay it out, was actually pretty logical, if you can just ignore the whole strapping bombs to bats part. A special canister would pop open midair, releasing over 1,000 bats. They'd fly off, find places to hide in buildings all over a city, and then, bam, timed incendiary devices would go off, starting hundreds of small fires all at once to overwhelm the firefighters. The idea was wild, but the military actually poured money into it.
And here's the really ironic part. The project proved it could work, just not quite how they intended. During a test run at an American airfield, some of the armed bats actually got loose. And where did they decide to roost? Right under a massive fuel tank, which of course they then set on fire. The whole project was eventually scrapped, not because of this little mishap, but because the atomic bomb came along offering a much more definitive solution.
You know, speaking of using animals in really bizarre ways, the United States wasn't the only one. During the Cold War, the British had their own feathered scheme.
The plan was as simple as it was terrifying. It was called Blue Peacock. If British forces had to pull out of Germany, they'd leave these massive nuclear mines buried behind them. The idea was to detonate them from afar, making the whole area radioactive and completely useless to an invading Soviet army. It was a scorched earth plan with a nuclear twist. But they hit a very, very cold snag. Each one of these mines weighed a jaw-dropping 16,000 pounds. That's over 7 tons. But the weight wasn't the real problem. The problem was the sensitive electronics inside, the detonators. They absolutely could not be allowed to freeze in the bitter German winters.
So this was the big question for the engineers. How do you keep a buried nuke warm? They needed a heat source that was reliable, could last for weeks underground without any help, and was super low-tech. Electric heaters were out, hot water wasn't practical. They needed body heat.
Yep, you are reading that correctly. The official declassified solution they came up with was to seal live chickens inside the bomb's casing. They'd get food and water to last about a week, and their collective body heat, according to the plans, would be just enough to keep the bomb's crucial components from freezing solid. Thankfully, the project was eventually canceled, and no chickens were ever actually sealed inside a nuclear weapon.
Okay, so now we're going to move from flawed logic involving animals to just fundamentally flawed engineering. In these next cases, the animal wasn't the problem. The entire design was just doomed from the start. Okay, check this out. In the 1870s, the Russian Navy wanted ships with bigger guns. Their solution? Forget the normal ship shape, let's build a circle. And as you can see from this little comparison, it was a terrible, terrible idea. A normal warship is long, narrow, and fast. The circular Novgorod? It crawled along at a top speed of 7.5 miles per hour. But even worse was the cannon recoil. When this thing fired its huge guns, the force would literally spin the entire ship around in the water. Imagine trying to aim when every shot puts you on a carousel.
You know, World War II was this incredible pressure cooker for innovation. But when you're moving that fast and trying to gain any possible edge, it also becomes a hotbed for some truly awful ideas. A lot of projects got the green light that, in hindsight, probably should have stayed on the napkin they were sketched on.
This was one of Nazi Germany's so-called wonder weapons, or wonder weapons. The concept here was to create this massive vortex of air, basically an invisible punch, that could fly through the sky and literally knock Allied planes out of their flight path. It sounds like something straight out of science fiction.
The reality, though, was kind of pathetic. In testing, the cannon could barely break a 1-inch thick wooden board from 650 feet away.
Now look at this chart, 650 feet. A typical bomber was flying at 20,000 feet or higher. It was like trying to hit a passenger jet with a spitball. Utterly, completely useless.
The Soviets, of course, had their own share of weird ideas. They were trying to solve a real problem. How do you get tanks to the battlefield quickly? Airdrops were tricky and slow. So they asked the question, what if the tank could fly? Or, glide at least.
So here's the fatal flaw. In order to make the tank light enough to actually glide, they had to strip it of everything that, made it a tank. They took out its extra guns, most of its ammunition, a lot of its fuel, even the headlights. It became a glider that couldn't really fight, which completely defeated the whole point. It had one very rough test flight, and the project was immediately canceled.
But for our grand finale, we have a weapon that doesn't just seem ineffective, it honestly seems like it was designed by a cartoon character who really had a problem with corners.
This is the Krumlov. It was a German barrel attachment for an assault rifle designed for one single purpose, to shoot around corners. The problem is, physics isn't a big fan of forcing a bullet down a curved pipe. The bullets would often just shatter into tiny pieces as they came out, and the barrel itself would be totally wrecked after just a couple hundred rounds. It was absurdly impractical and probably more dangerous for the person firing it.
So after looking at all this, chicken warm, bombs, circular warships, flying tanks, why does any of it matter? It's easy for us to look back and just laugh. But is there something more we can take away from all this?
Well, as completely absurd as these weapons were, they really do represent the messy and often hilarious process of trial and error that's just essential for innovation. For every F-22 Raptor, there's a flying tank that barely got off the ground. These failures are the necessary weird steps on the path to success. They push the boundaries of what's possible, even when they fall flat on their face in the impossible and dumb category.
And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. We can sit here and call these ideas failures because we have the benefit of hindsight, but in their day, these were cutting-edge, top-secret projects. And it really makes you wonder, what seemingly insane ideas are being cooked up in labs today that might, one day, either change the world or just end up in an explainer just like this one?